Computers. This is Intelligent Performance.
Lieutenant Colonel Dean Canham, thank you so much for joining us here on the Intelligent Performance podcast. A pleasure to have you with us yet again. For those who don't know Dean, as we'll go by in terms of today, Dean heads up the Centre for Army Leadership there in beautiful Sandhurst, who is responsible for the leadership doctrine across the Army. So first of all, Dean, welcome back to the show and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me back. It's a great privilege to be asked again.
No, it's terrific. And you were an absolute standout last year in terms of the listeners, the engagement which we received from our audience here. And where I'd love to start, actually, Dean, you've been hard at work in kind of really getting into the nitty gritty of leadership. I think you were only a few maybe months into the job when we first spoke. Can you just help us understand what have you been spending your time on in the first year when you're kind of trying to get into the nitty gritty, really trying to delving deep into leadership? What has kind of been the roadmap or the path been look like for the last 12 months?
Yes, when we spoke last time, I was pretty new in the job, and I think I probably gave, having learnt the relatively safe stock answers from Army Leadership Doctrine myself, I've now spent another 10 months or so exploring the nuances of it and pushing it on a little bit, hopefully. And I think probably a useful point to start with is reflection on how the job's affected me, because it's amazing opportunity to be able to study, research, and talk about leadership all the time. What it really does, though, is force a huge amount of self-reflection on your own leadership, which is probably about 20 years later than it should be. But that's a really interesting. It's definitely not a negative, but it's something which you do force yourself to pause and think about when you're learning about how excellent you could have been if you'd learned all this stuff and studied it a long time ago. So that's an interesting angle on the last year, I think. But as far as the team and the centre are concerned, there's been an ongoing bit of work that started just before I arrived on what we're calling the Leader Competency Framework, which we'll hopefully come to talk about it. It's the Army writing down formally for the first time what all of the skills, characteristics, and traits are of a good or ideally great leader, so that we've got a common language and a common baseline for the whole Army to refer to on leadership. And we have separately published the first Army Leadership Doctrine Policy. So that sounds like a bit of a dry subject. It is, but where the Army has never had a policy on leadership before, behind the scenes, what it actually does is it unlocks the ability for the general, who is director leadership, to actually direct people around the rest of the Army on leadership. Before, he wasn't empowered, signed off by the chief to tell people what they will do as far as leadership development, leadership courses, and that sort of thing is concerned. It was very much this is what we would like you to do. Now we've got a policy signed off. It lays out how we're going to progress leadership over the next 10 years, and it gives him the authority to make people conform to that. So behind the scene, that's a really useful step forward as well. And then probably the third big bit of work which has emerged since we last spoke was on followership. And we published in November a followership doctrine note to explain to people what it is, what the Army's view on it is, and why it will be useful for us going forward in the future. And we'll hopefully come to speak about that as well. So I think those are probably the three big bits that have happened since we last spoke.
What's your biggest regret, Dean, when it comes to leadership, given you've spent 12 months reflecting on your own?
It's very much that I didn't spend more time, perhaps even my first 12 months, doing it in this level of depth. Now, that might sound a bit luxurious and probably not really tenable. Of course, for an officer, their year at Sandhurst has a lot of leadership aspects of it, and the Sandhurst course has just been completely redesigned to put leadership very much as a central thread. But I would have spent more time focusing in on the real skills and traits of good leadership. I think another really notable reflection of mine, having done the job for a year now, and it's not just in the military, it's in businesses as well, is that everyone, it's what I call the smile and the nod when you're talking to people about leadership. Everyone goes on their annual leadership learning and development away day, their strategy day, whatever they want to call it. Everyone smiles and nods and thinks this is all great stuff. This is all the sorts of things I need to learn more about and change habits of to be a better leader. And then they drift away from that day to the inbox and the office and wait for the next day the year after and don't actually change any behaviors. So my one plea I have to anyone I speak to now, civilian or military, in whatever industry, is just to pick up one or two small things from what we talk about with the Centre from Leadership and seek to change some small behaviours on it. Because we're not asking people to completely revolutionise their personalities or their character, certainly not in a wanna, but if people continually pick off one or two relatively small skills or things they know they need to improve on, and most people know it themselves, they don't need someone else to tell them if they're really honest with themselves, then they just incrementally increase their leadership skills because they are skills that can be taught and learned and practiced and reflected on, and then they get better. And then a couple of months down the line, just pick off something else. And it would be nice if we could lay it on a plate for everyone the whole time, but it's a very individual development pathway that people need to go on. I give an example that I had given to me just before I started the job, actually, where I was on a day that sounds a bit like that, and they said, we're going to teach you how to listen. And of course, I thought, I don't need to listen to that because I know how to listen, I can hear. But then just in the space of 30 minutes, when they explained the difference between active listening and listening, and they spent 10 minutes explaining it and 10 minutes talking about how to do it, and then we spent 10 minutes practicing it. And in 30 minutes, you've gained a skill you didn't know you needed to have that can absolutely change how you go about your business interacting with the people who work for you, for with you, or when you're talking to your boss. It's just a really good example of a really simple, straightforward, small skill which you didn't know you didn't have, that you can teach yourself really just by looking it up online. And if people pick off one or two of those types of things every 1 or 2 months, everyone will get incrementally better, and workplaces generally, civilian or military, just become more pleasant places because people are better at their social skills, their interactions.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I thought you were going to say, when you said smile and nod, that everyone seems to smile and nod and think they know what leadership is. I find that's a typical response as well, not to mention kind of glazing over when it comes to development. But it's only when I more and more I find that the more I look at leadership, the more I learn about it, the less I feel like I know, or the more like there's some real nuances to it. And actually, what I thought it was is not really what it was, or is, and I'm really good at it. Like just been reading about transformational leadership and the impact it can have on effective commitment. So the love or the kind of feeling towards your employer or the organization that you're working with. And yeah, it's just mind blowing how important this is and the impact it can have on people. And we've got epidemics in a corporate world where people are just leaving companies. They don't feel like they're part of it anymore. And, small tweaks like that can make a profound difference. And I guess that's really where I want to touch on in terms of the Army. You had, I think it was last year now, Dean, forgive me, you'll know the specific date, but you held an Army-wide leadership day. And I guess it sounds a little bit like it could have been a smile and nod across the Army for a lot of people. But can you just help me get to the essence of what was the point of that? Why did you take the directive to basically tell everyone to spend one day focused purely on that skill?
Yeah, so it was just at the very beginning of this year, and it's I think, third iteration of it. It's what the British Army calls op teamwork. And the reality is the genesis of it 3 years ago was a new Chief of General Staff, and coinciding with some pretty poor behaviours that had created some bad scenarios and bad publicity for the Army as a result. And he came in and decided that he was going to tell everyone who wasn't on operationally essential duties just to stop for the day. And so they'd become known as all stop days as well. And he said, just for this day, we are going to focus on our culture. And really, it was about culture at that point. It still is. And it was seen as a positive step because, unsurprisingly, when you do force people to stop, force people to listen and talk and learn a bit about how to behave more appropriately, how to improve cultures, how to lead better, then they get a bit better at it. And it's kind of links to the smile and nod point where everyone agrees it's all good, useful stuff, but doesn't do anything about it. You do have to, perhaps as a boss, sometimes just force that time into the program and say, this is important. We are going to do it. There isn't stuff that's more important than this today. And so that program now, we're doing it once a year. It's migrated into a much more of a positive reason to do it. And this most recent one, we were asked to lead on the design for, and so therefore leadership, better leadership, as the main driver of better cultures was kind of the theme of the day. And so what it looks like an hour or so of video messages from senior officers or particularly well informed people on the subject, and then some presentations, discussions, which all run dispersed by all the units across the Army for the day, and then discussions and a bit of development of all the teams and groups that have heard and talked about the subject of the day. And then a bit of a team building activity, whatever the local commander decides that's going to be for the latter half of the afternoon. And so, yeah, it's a specific cultural improvement program, which the genesis was something negative, but now is very much seen as a positive day, which people enjoy having put in the program because it does give them the forced space and time to actually do it.
Yeah, interesting. Really, do you want to ask, how do you measure outcomes when it comes to something like that? What have you seen?
Yeah, well, as far as the statistics are concerned, then the Army runs climate assessments every 2 years for each unit, where there's a pretty extensive range of questions which every single individual in the unit is asked to fill out, and that's across a standard measurement then for the unit for previous climate assessments and all the other units. And then you can group that data based on their demographics, their responsibilities, what they've done. So if a unit's been away somewhere for a long time, you can compare that to another unit that's been away a long time, see if there's trends emerging, that sort of stuff. And then there's a broader tri-service armed forces survey that goes out periodically as well. That's a bit more sporadic. It might just be 10% of the unit that gets that, but that's looking more widely across the armed forces. But as far as measuring outcomes on things like culture and leadership, it's very difficult.
Yeah, it's very difficult. Yeah.
It's probably the question we've spoken about in my first year the most often, because there is, of course, a desire, especially by accountants or people running budgets in organizations, to say, if we're investing all this time and effort into training people on this stuff, what's the kickback? How does it make the bottom line look healthier? And I've got still two views. There are lots of different ways you can spend a lot of time to generate a lot of statistics to measure such things, none of which are fail-safe, and a lot of which can be interpreted in different ways, of course, or you don't. And actually, we accept that as professionals and experienced people, we all know that doing this stuff is positive and it's healthy, and we can stand back from our organizations and look at them 6 months down the line, talk to the people that are doing it, and just say, actually, yeah, it's a bit better. We can recognize it feels better, and therefore we know we're on the right track. So rising tide raises all ships. If we're all investing in this sort of stuff, you probably waste as much time and effort trying to measure it that you could reinvest in just doing it again. If we all accept that it's good, positive stuff, then personally, I think I'd probably lean towards that approach. And just by talking to the people, by seeing how many people don't leave, as might have otherwise done, then you'll know whether the organisation is getting better or not.
Yeah. And are you starting to see that? I saw, I think I was reading somewhere about the new recruits or something like that. I think it was, I revisited the followership recording actually, and it was just talking about the high level of recruitment in at least at the officer level. I'm not sure if it's kind of followed suit elsewhere.
Yeah, so Southampton's still full every time each course starts. I think there might have been a concern that there was going to be a bit of a dip approaching. Um, there isn't any shortage of people who are expressing interest to join the army.
Mm.
It's just some of the process and barriers that need to be lowered as far as removing bureaucracy and time from the process that tends to put people off. Where we want to maintain the standards, we just need to find those people amongst all of those that are applying and get them through the system a bit quicker. And that's starting to change and speed up now. So we're seeing an improvement in recruitment numbers across the board again. So these things tend to go in cycles, and of course they reflect what's happening in the wider country and the economy at the time. It's the same for every army.
Interesting. Let's touch back on followership. Right, you hosted a day. It's available on YouTube, and thank you so much for making it so widely available to civilians like myself. It was focused, and I think some of the early sessions on the day talk about how, whilst we love talking about leadership, largely speaking in companies, organizations, we don't talk about the obvious one, which is actually followership, which is effectively, and forgive me, you'll have to help me on the author's name, Irul Shalaf, is that right?
Ira Shalaf, yeah.
And he talks about the conundrum is that not many people grow up wanting to be a follower, and I think it's a really interesting conundrum. But yet we all follow in some way. I may follow my customers, you may follow your bosses, or we may follow our soldiers, or we may do many different things. And we lead and follow in the same moment often. Whilst we're leading others, we may be following someone else. So tell us, how's your understanding or engagement with the followership topic kind of grown, Dean, and what's kind of your biggest takeaways on this space?
Yeah, I think you've touched on the first hurdle that we have on it, in that you say nobody wants to go up to say they're going to be a follower. And culturally, perhaps there's just very negative connotations of the word. And that's the first barrier to talking about it, especially perhaps in an army where, of course, leadership is hugely valued, and rightly so. And we have a centre for Army leadership. We don't have a centre for Army followership yet. But it's if we accept, this is the best way it was explained to me, that all of us in every organisation are followers all of the time, and some of us are leaders some of the time, then why do we spend so much time focusing on making people better leaders when actually you're only impacting potentially on a small part of the organisation? If we focused on making people better followers, then you're impacting everyone in the organisation, and overall outputs should be better.
Yeah.
Now that's founded on an understanding that actually, of course, there's always nuance in these things. They're never straightforward. All of the skills that we would recognise of a good follower look quite similar to those that we would expect from a great leader. And so another of the first comebacks from people when you start talking about followership, or if people don't like the phrases, they refer to it being better if you had a leader model. So David Marquet's book, Turn the Ship Around, would say, we don't have followers on this boat. We have leaders and leaders. And you say, well, yeah, you could put it that way. But actually, if you look at all the skills of leaders, they look like good followers. And ultimately, they're still bosses, right? So there will be people leading and following at different times. It is a dynamic, as you described it. And interestingly, I was interviewing James Kerr of Legacy fame yesterday for a podcast, and he was talking about leaders shouldn't be seeking to generate followers; they should be seeking to generate new leaders. But it's the same point. if you are trying to generate good followers, they're going to look a bit like leaders, and sometimes they will be leaders. And so we don't need to worry too much about the language. But our point would be, if you want whole organizations to be better and everyone is a follower all the time, then focus on some specific skills, training, and characteristic development of followers, because then you're attacking the whole organization. And we published a doctrine note on it at the same time as we did the conference in November. People can search for that on any search engine, the British Army Followership Doctrine Note. It's all open source, as all of our stuff is. And it talks also about followership being an active role. If you talk about followership in the same way we talk about leadership, what you're doing is you're engaging your entire population. You're giving people, albeit informally, an appointment. Because as soon as you start talking about leadership, most of your organizations say, well, I'm not a leader, so I don't need to worry about this stuff. But
Yeah,
if
right.
you're appointing them as a follower with responsibilities, and if you are looking for people who are responsible, mission focused, actually confront issues, they collaborate, then you're saying, well, you are a follower and these are your responsibilities. It is your responsibility to do this, to take some ownership. I think in the business world, it's a pretty well-known phrase. If you act like you own the business when you work for it, then obviously you're going to generate a much more positive outlook and generate a more efficient team yourself. So that's what the followership doctrine note is seeking to attack, to get people better at supporting leaders through being good followers, and actually realizing that at any one point on any one day, you can switch between being a follower and a leader, depending on who's asked you to do something, how engaged you are with it, and whether you believe in it or not. And we sort of identified different types of followers. If you imagine in a sort of a quadrant, so top right, your exemplary followers, bottom right, your conformists, yes people, perhaps. So that's perhaps the more positive right-hand side of the diagram. And then on the left, top left, sort of alienated cynics. You don't really want very many of those. And then down in the bottom left, a sort of passive follower, sheep, if you like. A slightly less positive left side. And in the middle, probably crossing over all of them and moving around, are these pragmatists, these survivors, who move into each one of those boxes dependent on what they've been asked to do and who's asked them to do it and how much they believe in it or how they're feeling on that particular day. And most of us are probably pragmatists most of the time, but there are some people who get entrenched in one of those quadrants. And there is a skill as a leader in generating and managing followers that you probably want to move people from the left side of that diagram across to the right. And that's a skill in itself, recognizing where people sit and then trying to move them across. So rather than being alienated cynics, you want to shift them right across to be at least conformists and yes people, because they're quite useful in some organizations some of the time. And you want to move your sheep, your passive people across to being conformist, and then you want to move them all up to being exemplary, perhaps. But in different organizations, there's a different requirement, different followers as well. Actually, if you are a leader and you've got your team, your organization, who are all exemplary followers, well, point number one, you probably don't need a job anymore because they're doing it for you. Two, it would be exhausting because they would just be so enthusiastic and so proactive the entire time. And three, it might actually slow things down sometimes because they're being so positive in their offers of help, of advice, of opinions, when actually sometimes you just need to get stuff done. And you need a whole load of conformists to move all those boxes from there over to there. Let's get that done. It doesn't really require much discussion. And so it's a very dynamic model, but it's an interesting one. And much like the Pandora's box of leadership you talked about, where you start looking at it and you open the box, you fall in, and then you're walking around in there and you can't get out.
Yeah.
Rather than just sort of peeking and taking something. I think followership's probably a growth area in the same fashion.
Are you seeing given the relevance, I think that's a really powerful point you've just made, right? In terms of we're all followers all of the time, and then we're leading some of the time, some of us. Are you seeing that broader adoption, like just from an army perspective? Are you seeing that message really resonate more in terms of, do you think that is genuinely a future direction you'll go?
So it's still very early days for us. The doctrine note was published. That's kind of an interim sort of resource for people to use until we probably rewrite the Army's main leadership doctrine in a year or two, and then it will be incorporated into that. So it will feature in it much more heavily, and that tends to be the sort of, well, it is the go-to document for all things leadership, and it will be all things leadership and followership. So it will start to take time to permeate through the Army, and we try to get people over that hurdle of a negative connotation attached to followers. It has landed really well. There's a load of interest from other sectors, both public sector organisations and private, when we talk about it, because it looks, I think, when you explain it, hopefully in the way that I have, all of a sudden it looks like a big glaring hole in people's learning and development programs.
Yeah,
Why are we
massively.
just focusing on these few people when actually we need to focus on everyone?
It's a really good point, and we pour a lot of resources into a select few, but we kind of let the other ones just be, at worst, what did you call them? Alienated cynics.
Yeah.
I think you've described corporate workplaces everywhere.
Well, the subject it really seems to resonate on is, as an example, is change programs. You can have really good people leading really necessary change programs that never actually get implemented because people fail to follow them. And it's not necessarily just because the leader hasn't done a good job on it, or that the organization doesn't need to conduct a change. If you don't have the right manner of followership, it's just not going to work. And so that sort of thing has really resonated with corporate teams, especially about how to generate better followership so that things like that happen not just faster, but a whole lot more effectively.
Yeah. And I feel like there would be a key skill in how to develop a follower too, right? As a leader, like understanding, like if you're not a leader, so if you're a leader and don't understand followership, don't understand how to create it as well, how to make it an appealing state, you would have potentially what you talked about, all those proactive people, which could be all those people wanting to be a leader, and you've got no one to lift the boxes to extend your metaphor, right?
Yeah. And so on reflection, I'll tell you a very quick story because I didn't know it at the time, but I can look back on it now. There was a point on my third tour of Afghanistan, I was company commanding, and I'd had a young soldier get a catastrophic injury, lost both his legs, and 6 days later, his best mate, same thing happened, lost both legs and a hand. And literally, as the dust was settling on that second one, after the chopper had taken him off, and they both survived miraculously because of the efforts of their mates at the time. That moment where this has happened twice in 6 days, we're still relatively early in our tour, everyone's looking at you. You're the boss. What do we do now? And the absolute magnetic draw I can see in everyone's eyes, and what I know in my own heart is we just want to go back into the patrol base. But I also kind of knew that if we went back at that point early in the tour, it was going to make it really difficult every time we went out subsequently. I knew we had to keep going on that day, keep going forward. And this is a dilemma. It's a stereotypical cinematic dilemma for certainly military leaders in these sorts of scenarios. And I was starting to have the conversation with the other team commanders working for me at the time. I could see how little they were looking forward to going back to their troops and saying, we're pressing on. And the closest soldier to us as we were having that conversation, also one of the most junior in the company, just edged his way forward and very politely, as soldiers do when they're having these sorts of interactions, said, I'll go on point. And it was the point guy that had just been blown up, one of his friends. And he said, I'll go on point. I'll go first person in the patrol. And at that single point, he was leading the entire company, not just physically at the front of the line,
Yeah.
but leading it in that he absolutely changed the dynamic of not just that day, but the entire tour. Because all of a sudden, you saw the relief in his platoon commander's face, where it's like, okay, I've not got to ask someone to do that. He's just stepped forward, volunteered, and all of a sudden, the whole company's moving forward again, and we carried on moving forward for the whole tour. And so the most junior follower in the company, with one sentence, changed the dynamic of the next 5 months, just from good followership skills, which I now recognise, but very similar to great leadership skills, as I said. That can be hugely impactful for an organisation, just from, and if you can train people to be more like that, then all the better. The organisation is going to really benefit from it.
Phenomenal story. Wow. And I think, leading through challenge, like you talked about, and then having someone, a follower, step up and be a leader. It's so tricky with the language, isn't it? I think that's the thing which always kind of trips me up. It's really, we're talking about traits, or we're talking about behaviors, we're talking about mindsets, and they, maybe to some degree, followership leadership kind of causes its own issues as we try to be succinct language, right?
Yeah. And you can get bogged down in the language, or you can not worry too much about it and realize that they're quite similar, and
pretty much the same thing. Yeah.
And move on. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's do that. The Army is moving to develop a non-commissioned officer Sandhurst style setup. So for those who are unfamiliar with what this means, so in the British Army, they have Sandhurst. In the Australian Army, they have Duntroon, a specific centre for developing junior officers in an organisation or in the Army. And you're now moving towards actually setting up a similar style thing for a non-commissioned officer, which historically, Dean, that's something you haven't done. Tell us what's been the reason for that, and what are you trying to achieve?
So there's been some recent developments on it actually since we had our initial conversation. It probably well, and so there was never any aspiration to build another version of Sandhurst, but there was a recognition that non-commissioned officers need as much attention on their leadership development, personal development, as we give to officers. And there is a huge amount there already for non-commissioned officers, but it just needed a bit of an overarching approach to it that drew it together more neatly. And so just very recently, the NCO Academy was formed up. It's got some staff. It's starting to do the work on how it draws together the learning and development of NCOs. And for want of a better location to start, then it started at Sandhurst. So an officer-focused establishment, but that's where the space was, and that's where they could draw on organisations like mine to get themselves up and running, hopefully. And then there's been some recent developments where armies are always changing, as we know, and the whole of the Army's learning and leadership, education and development organisations are all being branched together in one organisation. So that would be really positive for all of them. So things like the Army Educational Services, the Centre for Army Leadership, the NCO Academy, some of the organisations that run adventure training and sports, that sort of stuff, are all going to come together under one organisation, not in one place. It's far too big and diverse, but in one organisation called the Leadership Education Development Group, in which the NCO Academy will sit. And so you'll just see a whole load of better collaboration between those organisations for making soldiers and officers better overall.
Why, given that you said there's been already existing resources there. Why this move? So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think the view was that it was just a little bit disparate, and it looked organisationally like they weren't getting the level of focused attention that officers get from Sandhurst.
Right.
And so it's there's not loads of buildings going up that people are going to march up the steps of if they're an NCO. There aren't lots of new courses being designed and developed straight away. It is a group of people who can have an overview of all of the training, education, development that happens for NCOs, make sure it's coherent, make sure that all those things that are in place already are complementary and progressive as they go through people's careers. So that's the first stage, and then we'll see where it gets to in the future. It will be a much more coherent through career package, which only those soldiers that are just getting promoted on their first promotion now to Lance Corporal will see the full benefit of through the next 20 years of their career.
Oh, yeah. As I understand it, there is a general move also to more disseminated leadership styles across the army. Is that correct, Dean, or have I misquoted something there? Just in terms of the need or the ability, given that we have new levels of communications that we can disseminate messages instantaneously. Are you seeing that, or is this a kind of a reciprocal move, as it were? Okay, well, we can do this now, so it does make more sense to empower a junior person in a far different way than kind of more traditional communication methods would have allowed or required.
So I'm not sure if there's any specific programs on it, but certainly from the Centre for Army Leadership perspective, we do talk often about things like this podcast and the fact that whilst this is a military organisation talking to a civilian organisation, we will rebroadcast that on all of our channels because we encourage people to listen to questions from other organisations, and we run our own podcast series, the Centre for Leadership podcast and the Human Advantage podcast, which respectively look at a up and out cross-sector audience on the first one, and then a down and in more tactical military one on the second. And we find that in large organizations, particularly very hierarchical ones like armies, sometimes it's really difficult to force your doctrine, your thinking, your latest ideas all the way down through that chain of command. It either gets buffeted off on the way down to more junior people by other important stuff or gets watered down. And so the use of podcasts, things like that, the YouTube channel, which we run as well, just means we're not undermining the chain of command, but we're bypassing it in a lot of stuff which we know is positive. And so we get a huge amount of engagement from young soldiers and officers listening to our stuff, whereas previously, not that many years ago, people would have been told you've got to read it, or it would have been forced down, or even used as a punishment. Sometimes, if you've done something wrong, say, go and read this stuff and write me an essay on it.
Yeah.
Actually, the modern forms of communication that we've got, and particularly the podcasts where we get people to tell their stories about it, and we know that storytelling is one of the best ways to communicate these sorts of ideas, has been really impactful for us. We've got a really good followership on the podcasts, on the YouTube channel. We make everything we do open source. It just means that even the most junior soldier and all people that aren't in the army can listen to it and learn from it, hopefully.
I think it's both those which you've mentioned, the podcast. I'm a regular listener. Phenomenal in terms of the input. I think I take as a civilian and hearing, I think I just heard a snippet most recently of the former top spy on your podcast, and how they navigated or the requirement to have courageous communications. When he was talking about speaking truth to power, and I just thought, wow, like that. I know in corporate organizations that I work with, that's a major issue they have, not necessarily telling politicians, but telling their CEOs or telling their senior leaders that there's a problem. And that can be a massive issue within these organizations because they're not getting the right information from their people. So yeah, I think your channels and it's super applicable to a mainstream audience, even if you don't have two sets of interests in a military context. I think it's super translatable. Is that what you're finding more broadly, Dean, in terms of the feedback you get?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that interview with Sir Alex Younger, as you say, former head of MI6, he was one of the most fascinating people I've met, to be honest. And I could have spoken to him for hours, even though, of course, in theory and in practice, he couldn't actually tell me anything that he'd done. But yeah, he still had this huge wealth of knowledge and character that he communicated. Interesting on that point, he was making about truth to power.
Yeah.
A very quick circle back onto that followership doctrine note we've written. There's only one short annex on it on one page, and it's about challenge. And we've had a bit of a discussion about challenge culture. It's a very familiar term to a lot of people, and the benefits of having people that speak up and speak truth to power. But challenge in itself, I find, is an adversarial word. And as soon as you say that you are challenging people, then they get defensive because people don't like to be challenged. So I'm tending, and it features in that annex a little bit, to use the word offer. Actually, you want an offer culture where people are willing to offer their views, their opinions, and their red flags. And if you say to people, I want you to offer your views, your opinions, and definitely any red flags to me, that sounds a whole lot less intimidating than I want you to challenge me. And it takes a lot of the heat out of the discussion before it's even happened. And so that single page annex on the followership doctrine note is about challenge. It's actually a cut and paste of the Chilcot from the Chilcot report on why we went to Iraq and why people in government departments didn't challenge the momentum behind that as it was happening at the time. And we were going to write our own one, but actually we didn't need to. It's already there. It's the single annex to the followership doctrine note, how to challenge, but actually it uses the word offer in there a few times as well, how to offer views and opinions. And it's a really useful reference point for people if they're looking, not just, it's split in two halves, how to offer views and opinions and how to receive them.
Yeah.
Without turning people off.
Like we have corporate leaders literally stare at us and say, and ask us, say, how do we get our people to tell us what they really think, or to challenge us, or to speak up, or to lean into a difficult conversation? And because I'm not sure if it's a generational thing, but like millennials particularly struggle with that. I think Gen Z are probably finding it even harder, just to your point around that kind of, it's tricky for younger people with less developed social skills. They've grown up where texting is normal. You just WhatsApp someone, you don't have to necessarily, or you just don't talk to them, right? Not necessarily. And where when you welcome to the world of work and progress, it becomes, you don't get the best solutions without challenging each other. So are you finding that, just out of interest, in terms of, you've talked about the redesign of Sandhurst? It'd be good to kind of hear a bit more about that. Are you finding that generational change at all? How does that kind of translate into Army training, and kind of what you're finding in the generations is missing, perhaps?
Yeah, so we would say that it drives a demand for improved social intelligence. So where emotional intelligence everyone recognizes as something we need to be better at, and we would say comes before IQ, before the actual skills and drills that you can teach people. Armies are really good at that. Most organizations are good at teaching people how to operate their thing. We would say you've got to look inwardly first, develop self-awareness through emotional intelligence. Next step between that and learning how to do your job is your social intelligence, how to interact with people who work for and around you, and who, if you work for them, how you interact with them. I would say that every generation, of course, thinks that it's not quite connected with the one above, and that's the same in families, it's the same in workplaces, it's the same out in the rest of society. So it's always a current issue between the current generations. We put the tags on them of millennials and Gen Zs, etc. But there's a reason why things like that challenge annex is split in half, because there's two sides to that coin. Yes, young people in organizations are different, in the same way that the people that are old in those organizations were different to the people who were older when they joined 20, 25 years ago. So I think the requirement for better EQ and SQ, emotional and social intelligence, is required from from everyone in the organisation. You just got to keep moving everyone on to understand the other people. And this particular most recent generation coming into the workforce have communicated differently or been forced to communicate differently because of things like COVID. And so there's a huge opportunity for organisations who are willing to invest in developing social intelligence of their people for the individuals and for the organisations. And we would encourage people to do that. From a military perspective, of course, it's one of the organisations that absolutely thrives on having brand new, very young people just as they're entering the workforce in it all the time, every week. Every week there are 17 and 18-year-olds turning up in military units. So it's just normal to be bringing young people into the organisation. And if you don't, then further down the line, you're not going to have an organisation. So
yeah,
those people are always changing. They will always be different. And there will always be friction between generations. That's fine. We just manage our way through it and ideally lead well through it.
Basically, there's no change. It's just, well, change is always constant. What your point is, right?
We would say that the nature of humans stays the same. The character changes. It's all situational, and you just got to be able to recognise what the situation dictates at any one time.
Yeah, I love that. Let's talk about Sandhurst. So there's a year-long course at Royal Military Academy Sandhurst. I've had the pleasure of spending about 30 days there and scared the living heebie-jeebies out of me. You've been through a redesign in terms of the actual program. So, Dean, can you just talk us through the process? I'm intrigued. You mentioned right at the start that how leadership has become like the spine or the common thread throughout. I thought that was there already, and I guess I'm kind of curious as to hear when you started to look at it, what did you find was at the center of it? Was it just to make people's lives difficult for 12 months? Was that the common thread?
Well, I mean, that might be how it's interpreted by those on the course, certainly, but most of the time they don't know what's being done to them. There was a recognition maybe 18 months, 2 years ago, that the course had become a bit dated.
Right.
And in institutions, great institutions like Sandhurst, it's quite, you need sometimes people just to step back from it and have a look and say, we just need to modernise and bring this on. It's prompted really by the war in Ukraine as well. And there was a reflection that we just needed to step back from the course, look at it and modernise it, in effect, and just broaden people's horizons, perspectives, and update them on the modern fight that potentially people might well have to go into. And so that prompted a redesign of the course where traditionally the course has been focused on using light infantry platoon tactics as the medium through which you test people. And I say test on here physically, psychologically, and conceptually as well. That's relatively straightforward and probably a bit too straightforward. And hence the main driver of the change was actually, let's get people to look in a wider, what we would call combined arms mindset. So not just low-level infantry tactics. We need people to think about how the tanks are operating, how the aircraft are operating in and around them, how the missile systems are going to interact with them when they're fighting. And we just broadened up and out the scope for them to think about whilst going through the course. Naturally, it's very difficult to recreate those elements physically for people going through an initial training course, but get them to think in those sorts of dimensions. And at the same time, then it became obvious that Centre for Army Leadership's republished the doctrine. It's written the Leader Competency Framework that says all the good things that leaders need to be. It just timed really well for us to lean in to make sure that what was a whole load of good but disparate leadership ideas and training that was mixed in with the course became an absolute common spine that ran through it, that reflected the doctrine and that you could hang everything else off. And so what you've got now, broadly 3 terms of the year at Sandhurst, 3 main sectors of British Army Leadership Doctrine, what leaders are, their character, what they know, their knowledge, what they do, their actions, broadly translates into 3 really simple chunks you can deliver on 3 terms through the course, along a progressive journey of leadership from potentially someone with no experience at all to someone who's going to step out on operations with 30 soldiers under their command on day 1. And so the course was redesigned to incorporate a slightly more complex military requirement, but then nicely timed for new leadership doctrine to redesign it as well. And so I would say, I think that it's certainly the only course in the British Army, potentially in the world, that is designed from scratch with leadership as its central spine for a whole year. Definitely out in the civilian sector, I've seen nothing that replicates it at all. A full-time leadership course for a year, that's a pretty huge investment for an army to make and to focus on and to isolate, where leadership is the foundation of all the character, knowledge and actions of individuals. Then it's a great compliment to the Centre for Army Leadership and the work that all the team do. And it's a great recognition of how important the Army thinks leadership is for the future of itself and its people.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting, I'd say. Like the ripple effect, right, of your work is going to be, I guess it's really starting to ramp up now. Is something to read a doctrine, there's something to read a paper. And as you kind of talked about it is very difficult to then apply that and to be pragmatic and kind of revisit that and kind of centrally embed those behaviors. But when you've got a whole organization and you've got the team and everything around that over a year to really embed that, it's going to be fascinating to see how that transpires, right? And what results in that. Have you got, just from the staff or personnel which you're working with, what are you starting to see already in terms of that, when you start to go, well, let's make it this central thread? What are the early indicators, I guess, you're starting to show up?
Well, the first course on the new design starts in 3 weeks' time.
Right.
So it will be, so we had the commissioning parade for the last intake on Friday last week. So it will be this time next year where you will have officer cadets who have done the new course all the way through for the first year. And so that will be the time where we'll be able to step back and look and see if they look or feel a bit different. I suspect outwardly they will very much look the same, but internally, and as they walk away up the steps out of the academy, they will have had a very different experience at Sandhurst without knowing any different. But that will, as you say, have a ripple effect through the army now from this point onwards.
Yeah, fascinating. Dean, I need to draw the conversation to a close. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much for sharing some insights into what's going on. I love the commitment that you have to, and I mean that as a representative of the British Army, in terms of, I love how seriously you take this. And I think it's something which civilians can really learn from. And I think many civilian workplaces can look at your resources, which you make so widely available, because they don't necessarily have the time, maybe interest even, to spend so much time really focused on this. But it is absolutely critical to these organizations' success. And I think they can leverage a lot of the work you're doing. And for that, I just want to extend my thanks, because I take lots from it, and no doubt lots of hundreds of thousands of people do as well. So Dean, thank you so much for joining us again. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been great to talk.